about why clients are scared of Drupal. You folks may have run into this already. I hope you haven't run into a lot. But what I'm hoping to give you is just based on my own experience, my colleagues' experience, basically some quick talking points that you can either take, discard, elaborate on if you run into situations as I have over the course of the years. So a little bit about me. My name is KellyT. I work with KellyT Partners. We are a local Chicago development firm. We focus on trial consulting, management consulting, and technology consulting. I was a part of the technology consulting arm. We work primarily with government and nonprofit entities. We do some work with private industry as well, but government and nonprofit is really our sweet spot. And like many other firms here today, we are hiring. So if you're interested in doing some Drupal development or theming, talk to me afterwards if you want to work in that government and nonprofit space. So a little bit about my background. I started off as a cold fusion developer approximately 1 million years ago. As so many local shops, we started out with doing some custom coding, and then we developed our own proprietary CMS. Those were some fun years. And then we started moving into multiple CMS implementations. I probably worked with close to a dozen different content management systems over the course of the years. And again, over those years, I moved into different project roles, more into project management or business development roles. So this is a long way of saying that I've been around the block a few times. I started working with Drupal in 2007 with Drupal 5, which feels also like a very, very long time ago. So the plus side of all of this background is it's given me a wealth of experience in working with clients. I've seen a lot of fear and anger in my time over the course of doing web projects. And these fears are not going to be a surprise to many of you, I think. A lot of clients, when we're working with them, they're just afraid of change. They've been working with whatever technology they've been working with, and they're used to it, and they're scared of moving to a different platform. If it's a completely different platform, that can be very scary. I work with clients that they were entirely a Microsoft shop, and then they moved to a LAMP environment with Drupal specifically. That wasn't just new tech, that was the skill sets of their entire internal IT staff had to change. But any fears related to that sort of came back to the project team. Fear of new responsibilities. This rarely gets articulated in my experience, but inevitably at some point when you're developing a website, you're talking to the people who are actually going to be putting content. And they might not say it, but in their eyes, they're asking, are you making more work for me? Am I going to have to do more in this new system? And inevitably there's a fear of failure, especially since a lot of the clients that I've worked with over the years, they might, over the course of their career, be involved in 1 to maybe 3 website projects, but it's not their main focus. And so they're putting a lot of trust in whoever their development team is to get them to the finish line, and they don't necessarily have a lot of input or control. They feel like they don't over whether or not that's going to be a success. And this last point is really sort of what the driver was for me to create this talk, which is I haven't always known when these fears are going to surface. A lot of times it's easy if they surface during the business development phase, where you can talk through and say, you guys might be concerned about this. Let me tell you X, Y, and Z why it's not a concern. What has thrown me over the years is sometimes you might be in the discovery phase of the project, you might be in the QA phase and ready to launch, and some of this stuff comes up. And it comes up for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the people that you're working with on the team aren't the people that actually made the technology platform choice, and so they don't feel like they had any control over this. So just so you don't get sideswiped, that's why we're talking about this today. Because fear is the path to the dark side, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. Oh my gosh, does it lead to suffering? If you have a client that's really fearful and angry, inevitably that blowback comes to you when all you're trying to do is get through and create a really great website. So even though you didn't sign up for being a client therapist, you're going to be a client therapist at some point. And so hopefully we'll talk through some of the tools that can really help you get through this. Part of the reason I gave you some of my background at the beginning is to let you know that I have had experience with other coding systems, other content management systems, and Drupal in particular has been really scary for people. It's been a big enough change that they get much more nervous than, say, if they're working with something that Microsoft has produced. So what are these fears? So this is what we'll go through. So what's with the name? That comes up if people are really not familiar with the technology. What company supports it? They're looking for some sort of big name commercial backing. And, you know, what is open source even? So in a previous life, I worked with a lot of law firms, and they were not really down with working with open source systems necessarily. There's this reverse cynicism sometimes that comes out, which is, well, if the software's free, it must not be very good. That's a fun one. They don't understand how it works. What do you mean there's this module system? What are you getting out of the box? I don't understand that. Security. This usually comes in from sideways where a security issue comes up. Fear of upgrades and loss of support. You know, again, that idea of the community supporting the current version of the previous one can scare people. And then finally, assuming that they've gotten through all of these other things, it's, I don't even know where to start with all the tools that you've given me. So let's tackle these one by one. So the first one is really, what's with the name? What's with the name Drupal? Sounds kind of weird. I've never heard of it before. This happens a lot if you're working with marketing people, because IT people usually have some familiarity with it. That's not really what they're asking, right? They don't really care about the name. What they want to know is that this isn't something that you just made up in your closet 2 days ago. It's very reassuring if you let people know this is something that's been around for more than 10 years. You might not have heard of it. It might be new to you, but it's got some solid history behind it. It's supported by thousands of developers around the world. The idea when you're talking to somebody that this isn't new, it's established, and if this doesn't work out, if this relationship doesn't work out with you as a particular developer, they're not stuck. There's a whole other crew of people that they can go to if they need to. And finally, at this point, and this will come up several times, it's worth reminding the client, we are proposing this platform for you because you came to us with a particular set of problems. And Drupal is going to solve your problems. And you can go through point by point why Drupal is going to do that. So if you get past the name, then you move into sort of a related version of it, which is, so what company supports it? Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, you know, again, especially if you're working in a fairly conservative industry, they are going to look for some sort of security blanket related to a big commercial name. This is where often it's very reassuring to let them know they have a choice. There is commercial support if they need it. You know, just pointing them to the fact that Acquia exists is often very, very reassuring. There are consultants and freelancers available. So people sitting in this room, you can work with us. You don't have to do this all by yourself. And finally, reminding them they always have the choice of taking this internally if they want. One of the best projects that I worked on over the course of my years was a publishing company that came to us and said, we need your help, but eventually we're going to be hiring our own development team to take this over. So if you know that ahead of time, it would be really great if you can help us get up the first few sites and then actually bring our development staff on board and sort of show them the ways of Drupal. And we did that. It worked out great for everybody involved, but it was very reassuring to the suits who held the purse strings for that particular client that they weren't tied to us as a consulting firm. This often comes up, again, if you're working with very, very conservative industries, but if you talk about open source, the first thing they think is it's just a bunch of people hanging out in a room, kind of thinking big thoughts. You need to educate them at this point to let them know open source communities are really large. Again, it's not just like 4 or 5 guys sitting in their basement drinking a few beers, although that helps coding sometimes. But it's really a large community. There are very specific coding guidelines. You know, if you've ever gone through the process of submitting a module up to D.0, you know the first thing they're looking at is how does this thing follow the coding guidelines. And there's peer review. Again, if you're putting a module up on Drupal, you're going to open that to a lot of eyes, and you're going to hear pretty quickly back from people if that's not code that's up to snuff. You get what you pay for. Again, this will come out if the client is feeling particularly cynical and free software, what is that? This one is usually more successful to just turn this back around on them and say, yes, you actually are getting what you're paying for. Because let's focus on what you're paying for. There's a lot of expertise that went into creating this software that's free, but for your particular implementation, you're paying for the expertise to put that software together in the best way possible for your organization, and all of the creativity involved in user experience design that goes into making this not just work well, look great, and provide the best experience for your clients, your customers, whoever the end user is. This one makes me a little bit angry. Assuming you get past that point, oftentimes they get to the, wait, how does this even work? I don't understand how these pieces come out. You're telling me that you can install this out of the box, but I'm not seeing very much. What's going on here? This is supposed to be a picture of a Death Star, but it didn't really scale very well. It's important to remind them that with the right materials, you can really build anything. It's worth educating a client who doesn't know to go through, well, what does this module approach mean, really? What is core versus contrib? And oh, by the way, you still always have the option of creating custom modules. This next thing that's been surprisingly effective is detailing out the modules that you'll use. Your clients won't always understand what that means, especially since some of the Drupal module names don't necessarily match one-to-one with what their functions are. But I can tell you that the fact that a client has a list to hang on to, oh, this is what's going on in my site, and they have the potential to show that list to other people, is hugely, hugely comforting. It's weird, but it works, or it has worked in my experience. Security. This one I really love because it's always like a Kramer-esque experience, right? Like you're having a good conversation, your client's on board, and suddenly the door bursts open and somebody jumps in because they read a news article 2 months ago, Drupal's awful, oh my gosh, what are you guys doing? This kind of requires multiple approaches. The first is this, whole security is always an issue, regardless of the software. That might calm them down, but of course it's not going to convince them that Drupal is necessarily secure enough. Unfortunately, we have recent experience of how quickly the Drupal community can respond. But it's worth pointing out how quickly the Drupal community did respond. And people were all over it once Drupal again sort of surfaced and made our lives miserable. It's also worth reminding them that regular updates are part of the process, and you get notified. It's not a surprise. You can sign up for security alerts. Goodness knows when you're logging into the administrative tools, you're going to get alerts if something is out of date. Nothing is hidden or secret. It's also worth coming at it from a different approach, which is to say, listen, part of the ability of leveraging a community is that this community has gone out of its way to document the best practices of writing secure code. Again, this is not some sort of hidden special area of Drupal, but something that's very, very much directly approached. Fear of upgrades and loss to support. So again, assuming that you get through all those other pieces of conversation, the whole idea of the community supporting the current version and only the previous one can be pretty scary, because if you just leave it at that, it sounds like next week this is going to go away. You need to reassure them they're not alone, and part of this not alone means that yes, Drupal upgrades on a regular basis. No, there isn't going to be a straight migration path. Certainly there hasn't been for the last several versions, and it doesn't look like there's going to be for D8. And this is what I would lean on most heavily. The timeline is in your favor. It's not going to be a surprise. Goodness knows we've been blowing the Drupal 8 horn for, it seems like, forever now, but there's nobody that I'm talking to these days that's surprised or doesn't know that there's another version coming down the pike. so they can have an informed conversation about, well, which version should we start developing on. The idea that D7 at least is likely to be supported for 5 to 7 years, because it's going to be supported until Drupal 9 comes out, is a huge relief. Because again, depending on what industry sector client you're talking to, if 5 to 7 years, they're probably thinking about creating a new website at that point anyway. And certainly if they're living with a website for 10 years, that's still enough for them to bank on and plan for. So the timeline is a huge reassurance for people. What do I do with all this stuff? Where do I even start? I can do so much with Drupal. I don't know what I should be doing. How does this work? This is the point at which, and this usually comes up late in the game, this is the point at which you need to get them from point A to point B. You need to start telling them stories. Explain the process. Again, remember, these are not people who do websites every day. They don't swim in this stuff the way that we do. So explain the project process. Explain where they're going to have input, where they're going to be able to make decisions, where you're coming back and making recommendations, what the next steps are. And I know that you've told them this already. They have all this information. That's why they made the decision to work with you. But you have to remind them. You have to repeat, repeat, repeat. Admin tools. Lots of people have said this before, but it's so worth repeating. Make them as friendly as possible. They might make sense to you and me, but out of the box, at least the Drupal 7 admin tools, those can be really overwhelming. And sometimes the locations of things aren't necessarily where you think they should be if you're not a Drupal developer. So make them friendly. Use admin-specific themes. Pare it down, only show people what they need. Because if you're in a user training session, which in my experience usually comes up fairly late in the game, if you're in a user training session and you've got people who are inputting content, they're the people that are going to be using this day to day, and they get thrown off, you're going to lose the game right there. So make those tools friendly. Tell them a story where they're the hero. Again, they came to you with a very specific problem. There was a reason that you recommended Drupal as a specific solution to their problems. Remind them how Drupal's going to solve that problem, and that they're going to be the hero at the end because they can now maintain the website moving forward. And usually at that point, they're pretty excited and pretty comfortable and really ready to move forward. Questions? This is one of the short talks, so I went through pretty rapidly. Questions, experiences, things to add?
I think you covered it, but it seems like when you give them the list of modules, that's reassuring at one point, and then it morphs into panic, what do I do with all this stuff?
Yes, because a lot of times you have to explain, you're not necessarily going to have to touch any of those modules, you don't necessarily have to administer any of that, but the idea, especially because it's usually, I would say, a mid-level person that I'm working with, the idea that they can take that list and show people above them and people below them, this is what we're doing, they feel like they're covered.
So in your personal experience, what would you say is the number one other system that Drupal is compared with?
In my experience, it's usually a Microsoft product of some kind.
Like a SharePoint?
SharePoint, Sitecore often comes up too, that's another one. But it tends to be some huge, big enterprise company. And they have a very hard time, at least initially, they have a very hard time understanding how an open source project could give them the same experience as something supported by a huge. That's when you get into demos and stuff. That's usually in the sales process.
I found regarding that sort of comparison, sometimes showing with the, I think it's called Unit Black Duck or something, software portal, it actually does an estimation of how much money it would cost to build an open source project by the lines of code. And then when you look at the number of people, it's like in the billions of dollars. So then it gives them some confidence.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Because the other thing they're looking for too is, which inevitably comes up, is total cost of ownership. Not just like the investment upfront in developing the code and providing that comparison, but you know, if you're licensing something like Sitecore, that's some big money over the course of the years. You know, that sort of makes them a little bit more comfortable with making a solution choice that they wouldn't otherwise be comfortable with. Yes.
When we're talking about the admin tools and the simplicity, what do you think is a good time or approach to get the client familiar with how the Drupal admin interface works, and even as simple as editing to maybe more advanced topics?
It's two levels usually, again, depending on the size of the enterprise, because there's usually two different types of training. There's somebody who's going to be the relatively sophisticated keeper of the keys on the client side, where you hope they're going to have somebody who's a sophisticated keeper of the keys. And that you want to expose as much of the admin tools as possible to them and simply go through the course of instructing them on where things are. Where it gets a little bit scarier is if it's, you know, Susie who's just doing press releases, she doesn't need to see all of that. And so usually, to answer your actual original question, it's usually at the point where you're doing user training. Susie, this is how you're actually going to create a press release. But at that point, you should have developed the admin tools enough so that she's only seeing what she would see. Yes.
So what if you are both client and consultant? So we're doing this process in-house, so we are both sort of the fearful and also the assuager of fears. So do you have any recommendations for that kind of scenario?
Bring cookies to the meetings.
Yes. I mean, as much as possible.
Right, the tough part is, again, it was my experience, because I wasn't always a consultant. There is some sort of weird voodoo where if you're internal, people don't believe you as much as if they hired an external consultant who would say the exact same thing. It's incredibly frustrating, but honestly, there's no good solution to that. It's a little bit cynical. I mean, you know, when I've been in that situation, I've pointed people to, you know, articles, comparisons. You know, you had mentioned the site that, you know, compares the lines of code. If there's something about if it's an internal project, there's just weirdly like a little bit less trust there, even if you're pointing them to external sources. I mean, the ideal would be if you're doing an internal project, and I don't know if you have this option of doing sort of a pilot to get them to, you know, if they were doing a microsite or something, doing a pilot, so they didn't feel like they were they didn't have to eat the whole meal. They just had to take a bite of the apple, and once they were comfortable with that, they'd be more comfortable with moving further down the line. But that's not realistic. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, unfortunately.
That's good to know that there isn't one out there, so I should stop
There's
searching.
not a magic bullet, unfortunately.
But you can hire on sort of consultants that do assisted. So we don't do implementation, but just make sure you don't get stuck. And that they've seen all the pathologies and
Or find a trusted source that will validate you. So somebody that, you know, the people who have the fears trust, okay, yeah, this is someone that I know you didn't influence, that is some kind of set person that will say, yes, what they're doing is totally legit.
Yeah.
Right, that external source.
Yeah, exactly.
Somehow to validate what you're doing. All right, a couple more things. This is the requisite, hey, we're doing the sprint on Sunday, so if you can, please join us. And they did want to emphasize, if you've got feedback to give me, and I would certainly like it too, this is where you can give me feedback. I do have a PDF version of this up on the MidCamp site, so if you just wanted to like grab the PDF for talking points for use there, you can do that. Thanks, everyone.